So in my last video, I took a drop bar bike and put alt bars on it. In this video, I'm taking an alt bar bike, the Jones SWB, and putting drop bars on it to make the most ridiculous Road Plus Plus Road XL bike you have ever seen. Find out how it rides in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling and gravel exploring, hit that subscribe button. You have found your people. So I had so much fun doing a handlebar conversion that I thought I would take it up a notch with this one. The Jones SWB is of course the brainchild of Jeff Jones, the man that brought you the Jones bar. And this bike was designed to ride specifically around that handlebar. So what would it ride like if you replaced it with drop bars? If you're not familiar with the Jones SWB, check out my video somewhere over here. But basically it's built around a 27.5 plus tire. It's fairly tucked in the rear and lowish trail in the front, making for a fairly lively and light feeling bike despite its size and its weight. In doing this conversion, I thought the perfect handlebar would be the Ritchey Venture Max in size 52. These are brand new bars. Ritchey sent them over, and compared to other gravel bars I've tried, I just love these the best. This newest iteration has some really nice touches, including a flat top section that just makes it more comfortable for climbing. Other things I like about this handlebar is that it has a really shallow drop, so that makes the drop more usable for most people. Rather than being just some kind of decorative add-on, you can actually get into the drops and get into a more secure position when you're going off-road. So that was a handlebar. I needed a couple more things to make this conversion happen, namely road brake levers that had the same pull as mountain bike brake calipers. So these are some Tektro brake levers that are designed to have a long pull rather than a short pull, which works with road calipers. These are long pull, so they will work with mountain bike disc brakes. Very important detail, because if you use any regular kind of road brake lever, you're not going to be able to actuate the brake. The one final piece of the puzzle is of course shifting, and I wanted to keep this experiment as cheap as possible. So thankfully I actually had some 10-speed bar end shifters from Microshift. And because they are designed around 10-speed Shimano mountain bike drivetrains, they actually work perfect with the pre-existing drivetrain on the Jones. So overall, a fairly inexpensive conversion to add some new life to this bike. In doing the handlebar swap, I wanted to reuse as many parts as possible and avoid recabling where I didn't need to do it. So thankfully the brake housing was long enough to work. I didn't have to rehouse the bike. I just had to put in some new brake cables. I did have to cut some new housing for the shifter, but that wasn't too big of a deal. And I also added an inline cable adjuster to the rear derailleur, since it's not a road derailleur that has that built in. So to fine tune the shifting, that is a must. I set up the bike stand outside and braved the rain, and thankfully it only took me about an hour to do the full conversion. So how did the parts work together? I was actually fairly surprised at how strong the brakes were. I wasn't expecting much from this brake lever and brake caliper combination, but they had a lot of bite. I think the brakes themselves aren't anything fancy, but because the rotor is so big, they just have incredible stopping power, even though they're not a very well-known brake. In terms of shifting, this was another surprise. The index shifting worked perfectly. It took a little bit of adjustment, but it was cool to get index shifting with the mountain bike drivetrain with a drop bar setup without too much hassle. No need to go full access here, folks. Just get some micro shifters. So enough of the tech stuff. How did this combination ride? Was it awesome, or did it suck? Did I just ruin the Jones SWB by putting drop bars on it? Surprisingly, with the drop bars, the bike fit remarkably well. I actually was able to use the same stem and didn't have to lengthen or shorten it. It felt great right out of the box. So I set up the drops so they were a little taller than the saddle. This would make the dropped position more accessible and be more of a primary position. I think in terms of handling, it felt remarkably like a gravel bike with really big tires rather than a mountain bike with drop bars, if that makes sense. The SWB is fairly short, and it also has a lower trail than most mountain bikes. So with the drop bars, it had that familiar gravel bike feeling. This setup actually felt more at home than out of place, if anything. In terms of flatland riding, it was nice to have that lower drop position to tuck in and get away from the wind. That's one of the big complaints about the Jones bar, is that you are fairly upright and it's hard to hide from the wind. I did take it up one really steep section that hit about 16%, and it put the body position in a pretty good position for steep climbing. Because there is so much tire there, it just has a lot of grip. I didn't break traction, and because of that slightly more forward and lower position, I was able to keep the front wheel down even though things got around 16 to 18%. So in some ways, a little bit better of a steep terrain climbing bike when seated when compared to the actual Jones bar, in my opinion. But of course, that's only half the story. How did it do descending? I took it on a fairly mellow local trail here, which is generally flowy with a couple of chunky bits. I felt like the bike descended actually pretty well. I think the wide, richy handlebars gave a lot of control. The shallow drops really puts you in a secure position where you're not going to slip over the hoods, and it's wide enough to provide leverage to fight the terrain. I do think, however, because of the drop bar position, which is slightly more forward and slightly lower, it made steep descents feel a little bit more sketchy. One of the beautiful things about the Jones bar is that it does set you back and upright. So when the bike dips down, you have lots of maneuverability to move behind the saddle and use your arms for suspension. Whereas in a drop bar setup, you are already leveraged over the front of the bike. So I think in super technical or steep terrain, the Jones bike with the Jones bar is the better choice. However, if you are doing a route which is mostly chunky roads that doesn't have super steep and technical descents, the handlebars are actually a viable option. Probably the only other bike that I could compare this setup with is the Bear Claw Bo Jackson. Again, drop bar bike built around a 27 plus tire. Whereas the Bo Jackson was definitely lighter and climbed a little bit better because of its light weight, I think the Jones bike actually handled better in slow, steep climbs. It does have a highest trail of about 81, but not as high as the 88 that the Bo Jackson I tested rode. So it had less of a drunken goat feeling when I was climbing on steep terrain. That said, the weight was noticeable. As I was riding this setup, I kept wondering in what situation would this bike make sense. I think it's a stupid fun riding bike, but might be a little heavy for real competitive racing in this setup. Maybe with lighter carbon wheels and some other lightweight bits, but then that really starts to make the bike more cost prohibitive. Where I do see this setup make sense is if you are going to be touring on really chunky terrain. You might have expanses where there's going to be a block headwind and you have to tuck in. This setup will definitely let you do that a little bit better than the stock Jones bars. So if you're looking for a ultra rugged drop bar tour, then this option would actually be a great choice. Again, it rides more like a gravel bike with really big tires than a mountain bike with drop bars, if that makes sense. This setup also just makes a fun, ridiculous bike, a bike that's not too serious, that's really playful, that you can take on rough double track or single track and make your local trails feel more challenging. So I think I might keep the bike set up in this configuration for a couple weeks. I don't know if it will be its permanent configuration. I do think it loses some trail ability because of the slightly more forward and lower position. So it's become less of a mountain bike, but not quite sprightly enough to be a event bike for gravel events, but still a fun bike regardless for just exploring and tootling around. So what do you guys think of this conversion? Is it a complete sacrilege to put drop bars on a Jones bike? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon. You get lots of awesome perks so you can make conversions of your own. And as always, keep the supple side down.